It was a cold evening in 2018 at a small restaurant near Los Angeles. Lily Dawson, a 24-year-old waitress, was working for a long time that day. She was very tired but still smiled at every customer. That's when a group of bikers walked in. One of them, a big, tough-looking man named Vince, liked to make fun of people. Tonight he picked on Lily. "You call this good service?" Vince laughed as Lily put his plate on the table. "No wonder you work in a place like this." His friends laughed too. Lily felt her face get hot, but she stayed quiet and turned away. That's when Keanu Reeves, who had been drinking his coffee quietly, put down his cup. He looked at Vince with serious eyes. The whole restaurant went silent. Keanu was known for being kind and humble. He didn't like to fight, but this time it was different. He looked at Vince and said one word: "Apologize." The word was strong and clear. The people in the restaurant held their breath. Vince turned to look at Keanu and laughed. But when he saw who it was, his smile disappeared. The customers started whispering. Lily looked at both men, her heart beating fast. What was Keanu going to do? And what would Vince say? Vince tried to act tough. "Apologize?" he repeated, leaning back in his chair. He acted like it was a joke, but his fingers tapped nervously on the table. Keanu stayed calm. He didn't move, but everyone could feel his strong presence. The restaurant was completely silent now. Even the sound of forks and spoons had stopped. Only the neon lights outside made a quiet buzzing noise. Lily stood still, holding her tray. She had dealt with rude customers before, but no one had ever stood up for her. And now, a famous actor was doing just that. Vince laughed again and shook his head. "Are you serious? Since when do movie stars protect little waitresses?" His friends chuckled, but even they could feel the change in the air. Keanu didn't get angry. Instead, he spoke softly, but his words were even stronger. "Do you know what real strength is?" he asked. His voice was calm but powerful. "It's not about big muscles or making fun of others. It's about how you treat people who can't fight back. Right now, you're showing everyone here just how small you really are." The restaurant felt heavy with silence. Vince's friends stopped laughing. They looked uncomfortable now, like they didn't want to be part of the joke anymore. Vince clenched his jaw. Something in his eyes changed. For the first time, he didn't feel like the biggest person in the room. Lily felt a lump in her throat. She had always thought she just had to accept rude customers because of her job. But now, someone was showing her she deserved better. Vince let out a sharp breath. He looked around at all the people watching him. His confidence was fading. He picked up his fork and poked at his food, trying to act normal. But everyone knew he wasn't the same anymore. Keanu, seeing that his message was understood, turned back to his coffee. He didn't need to say anything else. He wasn't looking for a fight or attention. He just wanted to remind everyone that kindness matters. Lily swallowed hard and gripped her tray. She wanted to say something to Keanu, to thank him, but she couldn't find the words. She took a small step forward, and Keanu looked up at her. He gave her a small, kind smile and nodded. Something inside Lily changed. This wasn't just a moment, it was a lesson. And it was only the beginning. The restaurant stayed quiet. Vince, who had been so loud before, now sat in silence. His friends, who had laughed at his jokes, now avoided looking at him. Lily took a deep breath and held her tray tighter. Keanu Reeves, a man she had only seen in movies, had just stood up for her. Not because he had to. Not because anyone expected him to. Just because it was the right thing to do. As she walked back to the kitchen, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. For years, she had accepted being treated badly because she needed tips. But now she realized she deserved respect. Keanu kept drinking his coffee as if nothing had happened. He didn't like being the center of attention, but in that moment he had changed everything. Vince let out another breath and pushed his plate away. He wasn't hungry anymore. Keanu's words still rang in his ears, louder than his friends' laughter. His face felt hot, not just with embarrassment but with something deeper: shame. For the first time in a long time, he thought about what kind of person he was. Lily stepped out of the kitchen again. Something inside her told her she needed to say something. She walked toward Keanu's table, feeling nervous. Keanu looked up at her again, his kind eyes full of warmth. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Lily swallowed. I just wanted to say thank you." Her voice was soft. Keanu smiled and put down his cup. "No need," he said gently. "You deserve kindness. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." Lily's eyes burned with tears. How long had it been since someone had told her that? How long had she believed that being treated badly was just part of life? Vince shifted in his seat. His friends murmured among themselves. The once loud group had gone quiet. Keanu looked at Vince again. But there was no anger in his eyes, only understanding. "Hey," Keanu said suddenly. Vince looked up wary. "Why?" Keanu asked simply. Vince frowned. "Why what? Why do you treat people that way?" Vince didn't answer right away. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His fingers tapped the table as he looked down. Maybe he had never really thought about it before. The restaurant remained silent, waiting for his response. His friends shifted awkwardly, avoiding his gaze. Finally Vince let out a long sigh. "I don't know," he muttered. "It's just how it's always been." Keanu nodded slowly. "It doesn't have to be." Vince looked at him, his tough exterior cracking just a little. He glanced at Lily, then back at Keanu. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice quieter than before. Keanu gave him a small smile. "Kindness isn't weakness, Vince. It's strength." For the first time that night, Vince had nothing to say. He just sat there deep in thought. Lily turned back toward the kitchen, but this time she walked taller. She knew that tonight had changed something, not just for her but maybe even for Vince. And Keanu? He simply picked up his coffee and took another sip as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that restaurant knew that something important had just taken place. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his eyes full of curiosity. His voice was calm, not angry, not accusing, just wondering. Vince hesitated. No one had ever asked him that before. Not like this. People usually either yelled back at him or ignored him completely. But Keanu? He was different. His question wasn't filled with anger or fear. It was just curiosity. Something tightened in Vince's chest. He didn't like the feeling. His fingers curled into a fist on the table. He had spent his whole life being tough, making sure no one could make him feel small. That was the only way he knew how to survive. Then a memory flashed in his mind. A memory he tried to forget. He saw himself as a little boy, standing in the corner of a dark living room. His father's angry voice filled the house, shouting words that hurt more than punches. He remembered the fear, the way he had felt so weak. Vince had promised himself a long time ago, "I will never be that weak again." He had spent years making sure of that, being in control. Making sure others feared him instead of the other way around. He thought that was the only way to be respected. But now, sitting across from Keanu Reeves, a man who had respect without fear, something inside Vince felt different. He didn't like it. He didn't know what to do with it. So he said nothing. Keanu didn't push him. He just held Vince's gaze for a moment longer, then gave him a small nod as if he already understood. Lily, the waitress, watched from behind the counter. Her heart pounded in her chest. Something was happening here, something more than just an argument. She could feel it. Vince exhaled, his shoulders sinking slightly. Without saying another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills and tossed them onto the table. "For the waitress," he muttered. Then he stood up. His friends blinked in surprise. They hadn't expected that. They hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure what to do. But after a moment, they slowly stood up and followed him. Vince walked toward the door, but just before stepping out, he paused. He glanced back at Keanu. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something almost like gratitude. But he didn't say anything. Then he turned and walked out into the night. Lily stared at the cash on the table. Then she looked at Keanu. He gave her a small, knowing smile and picked up his coffee again, as if nothing unusual had happened. The diner returned to normal. The quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of forks on plates. But something had changed. No one in that room would forget what had just happened. The door swung shut behind Vince, the sound echoing in the stillness. Outside, his heavy boots scraped against the pavement. But his mind was miles away. Keanu's words repeated in his head. Why treat people that way? Vince had spent his life believing in one rule: be in control or be controlled. It had never once occurred to him that there might be another way. Inside the diner, Lily looked at the money again. It wasn't just the cash that shocked her, it was what it meant. Vince had walked in ready to humiliate her. She had seen his type before, loud, aggressive, the kind of guy who liked to make people feel small. But now something in him had changed. Maybe not completely, maybe not forever, but something. And she had seen it happen. Keanu sipped his coffee, completely at ease, as if none of this had been out of the ordinary. As if standing up for a stranger was just as natural as breathing. Lily hesitated before speaking. Her voice was quiet, almost afraid to disturb the fragile moment still hanging in the air. Why did you do that? Keanu looked up at her, his face calm. Because I've seen what kindness can do, he said simply. And I've seen what happens when it's missing. Lily swallowed hard. She wanted to say something more. She wanted to tell him how much it meant, how much it mattered. But before she could find the right words, another voice cut through the silence. Did that just happen? A man sitting at the counter wearing a worn-out baseball cap shook his head in disbelief. I mean, I've seen bar fights. I've seen arguments. But I ain't never seen someone shut a guy down like that without throwing a punch. The other diners murmured in agreement. A young couple near the window exchanged wide-eyed glances. An elderly woman sipping tea nodded approvingly. Keanu only shrugged. Violence isn't strength, he said. It's just fear in disguise. Lily felt something deep in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee machines humming behind her. For years she had believed that people like Vince, loud, rude, always looking for a fight, were just part of life. Something you had to put up with, something that couldn't be changed. But now, for the first time, she wondered if that wasn't true. If maybe, just maybe, people like Keanu, quiet, strong in a different way, were proof that kindness could be more powerful than cruelty. Outside, Vince reached his motorcycle. But instead of climbing on, he hesitated. His fingers hovered over the keys in his pocket, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed the moment in his head, the way Keanu had looked at him. Not with anger, not with fear, but with understanding. Vince clenched his jaw. He hated that look. He hated it because it reminded him of something he had buried deep. A memory flickered in his mind. A boy, thin, small for his age, cowering in a living room while his father's drunken voice thundered overhead. Words that cut like knives. Hands that never showed kindness. Vince had spent his whole life making sure he was never the one cowering again. And yet tonight, in that diner, he had felt it. Not because Keanu had threatened him. Not because anyone had overpowered him. But because someone had seen him. Vince exhaled sharply and shoved the memory away. He climbed onto his bike, gripping the handlebars tighter than necessary. His usual instinct was to push things like this out of his mind. To drown them in noise and motion. But this time he couldn't. Keanu's words followed him. Why treat people that way? For the first time in years, Vince didn't have an answer. Back inside, Lily wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how long she had been standing still. She needed to move. To work. To do something before the weight of the night became too much. But before she could turn away, Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. She shook her head quickly. You don't have to. He smiled. It's not about the money. He placed several bills on the table, far more than the cost of his coffee. It's about people. Lily looked down at the tip, then back up at him. For a second, she felt something tighten in her throat. It wasn't just about the money. It was the message. Keanu pushed his chair back and grabbed his jacket as he stood. He looked at her one last time. Take care of yourself, Lily. Her breath hitched. He had remembered her name. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, he was already heading for the door. The bell jingled softly as he stepped out into the cool night air. For a moment, Lily just stood there, watching through the window as he walked toward his motorcycle. It felt unreal, like a scene from a movie. But this was real, and it had happened to her. She looked around the diner. People were still whispering, still thinking about what they had just seen. Something had changed. And somehow Lily knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Keanu Reeves walked to his motorcycle. He didn't rush. His mind was still thinking about what happened inside the diner. He had seen men like Vince before, men who acted tough because life had been hard on them. Men who used their strength to feel something, anything. As Keanu reached his bike, he paused. Across the parking lot, just past the diner's flickering neon sign, Vince was sitting on his motorcycle. He wasn't moving. His hands held the handlebars, but he hadn't started the engine. He didn't look tough now. Instead, he looked like he was thinking, struggling with something inside. Keanu thought about leaving. He had already done what he came to do. But something about the way Vince just sat there made him stop. So, instead of starting his bike, Keanu walked toward him. Vince saw him right away. His jaw tightened. He didn't know what to expect. Maybe another lecture, maybe a smug comment. But Keanu didn't look like someone who had anything to prove. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at the road ahead. After a long silence, Keanu spoke. Have you ever lost someone? Vince blinked. Of all the things Keanu could have said, he wasn't expecting that. He shifted in his seat and let out a sharp breath. Why? He muttered. Keanu tilted his head but kept looking at the road. Because I have. Vince swallowed. He didn't want to ask more. He didn't want to care. But there was something in Keanu's voice, something real, that made it hard to ignore. Keanu's voice stayed calm, but there was sadness beneath it. My best friend Logan. I lost him when we were just kids. He paused, his eyes distant. Then my daughter. I never got to hold her. And her mother? He shook his head. Gone too. Vince's hands tightened around his handlebars. He didn't know what to say. Keanu finally looked at him. Loss changes you. Vince scoffed, trying to push down the lump in his throat. Yeah. Well, some of us don't have the luxury of being the nice guy after. Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're right. It's easier to be angry. It's easier to push people away. His voice softened. But that doesn't mean it makes you stronger. Vince clenched his jaw. What do you know about strength? Keanu gave a small, sad smile. More than you think. Silence filled the air. Vince shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing with memories he had spent years trying to forget. The nights he had spent alone. The faces he had lost. The pain that had shaped him into the man he was. The man he wasn't sure he wanted to be anymore. Finally, Keanu sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You don't have to answer me, he said. You don't owe me anything. He stepped back. Just think about it. Vince said nothing as Keanu walked back to his motorcycle. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt stuck. Inside the diner, Lily stood by the window watching. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. From something else, hope. She had seen men like Vince before, but she had never seen anyone talk to them like that. And as she watched Vince sit there, unmoving, she realized something. Tonight had changed more than just her. Keanu swung his leg over his bike, adjusted his gloves, and started the engine. Before he rode away, he looked back one last time. Vince met his gaze. For just a second, something passed between them. Then Keanu gave a small nod. No pressure, no judgment. Just understanding. Then, with a soft rumble, his motorcycle roared to life. The headlights cut through the darkness as he pulled onto the road and disappeared into the night. Vince sat there for a long time, staring after him. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The night air was cold, but he barely felt it. His hands trembled slightly on the handlebars, but he didn't know if it was from the cold or from something else. Something deeper. The memory of Keanu's words echoed in his mind. Loss changes you. Vince let out a sharp breath. He didn't want to think about the past. He had spent years running from it, hiding it under a tough shell so no one would see his pain. But something about tonight had broken through those walls. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, folded photograph. His fingers shook as he opened it. It was a picture of a little girl, blonde curls, bright blue eyes, no older than 6. She was laughing, sitting on his shoulders, her tiny hands gripping his hair like reins. His daughter Lily. Vince clenched his jaw, his vision blurring. He had been a different man back then, a father who loved his little girl more than anything. But life had a cruel way of taking away what you love most. It had been a rainy night, just like this one. He had promised Lily he would pick her up from school. But he had been late, stuck at the bar, drowning in his pain. She had decided to walk home alone. A drunk D. Logan ran a red light. She never made it home. Vince's hands clenched around the photograph, his knuckles turning white. The grief had never left. It had just turned into something else. Anger, bitterness, walls he built between himself and the world. He had spent years making others feel small because it was the only way to keep himself from feeling anything at all. And tonight, a man he had never met had seen right through it. Vince let out a shaky breath and wiped his eyes roughly before shoving the photograph back into his pocket. He had spent so long blaming the world, blaming fate, blaming himself. But what if Keanu was right? What if real strength wasn't in the walls he had built, but in the courage to finally let them fall? Vince stared at the road ahead. The distant glow of the city lights barely shone through the mist. He thought about turning the key, riding away, and forgetting tonight ever happened. But for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run. Instead, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen before finally dialing a number he hadn't called in years. It rang once, twice. Then a tired voice answered. Vince. He swallowed hard. Hey, Mom, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. There was silence on the other end. Then a shaky breath. Come home, Vince. Tears slipped down his face as he closed his eyes. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next video.